The, your story, Escape from Camp 14, is based on Shin's account, which is a bit of a moving target now. And I wanted to talk about that because as you were reporting on this incredible story, he changed his story a little bit. You had to deal with that. And very recently, he has changed it again. Why don't you talk about that from the point of view of like how you felt as a storyteller and whether you think his changes affect the truth of what he's telling?
It's a complicated question. In Escape from Camp 14, there are 2 chapters in the book that describe him as an unreliable narrator and demonstrate how he told for about 4 years one version of his life, and then he decided to tell me an alternate version, that he was the one who betrayed his mother and brother, and that betrayal resulted in their death, which he witnessed without any feeling. He told me that story in California in 2011, and it was completely different from what he had told to hundreds of people after his arrival in 2006 in South Korea. And it was the pivot point for my book. It gave him a kind of dark character, but also a credibility that he was now coming clean and telling this awful story about himself and what he had become growing up in Camp 14. He lied to me as well before he told me that story, and then gave me that version, and then he said that this was the final version. I hoped it was, but I doubt it. But there are elements. The word truth is very hard to deal with for someone who grows up, born in a political labor camp, and spends most of their life there, is tortured there, and also betrays his mother and brother and watched them die there. And the torture, I think, is very important to understand, and I want to show a few slides of Shin's body that will take this away from an academic discussion to a sense of what he endured. And I haven't tried this before, but let's see if it works. This is his back, where he was lowered over a fire and burned when he was 19 years old. Severe scarring from burns. This is one of his fingers on his left hand. His fingers, the fingernails on both hands were all pulled out as part of a torture after his first escape from the country when he made it to China the first time. And he was very embarrassed, ashamed of how he reacted to that torture. He did not handle it with balance and with courage. He collapsed as a human being. And he hid that torture until January of this year. At least he hid it from me. And during that torture, the middle finger on his right hand, by the time they got to that finger, he had completely lost control of himself, and he tried to rip his hands out of an apparatus that was holding them down so they could pull out the fingernails with pliers. And they got angry at him and smashed that finger with a hammer. And that's how he lost the end of the finger. And then these are his legs, where they were severely burned when he escaped Camp 14 and was caught his legs in the electrical fence surrounding the camp. So these pictures show that Shin Dong-yuk is incredibly physically and emotionally traumatized individual. A Boibu guard who lives
It's just going to make this noise for a few seconds,
Okay.
But you can just talk over it.
On my last trip to Seoul, I talked to a guard who worked for the political police that run places like Camp 14, And he says that he has talked to almost all of the camp survivors in North Korea, and that Shin is more scarred than any of them. And he also says that the scars are the signature scarring of the techniques that he was taught to do as a political policeman. He worked in 4 camps. So Shin's story has changed. He's changed the dates of his torture. He was not 13 when this has happened, he was 19. The camp that he grew up in actually changed. The borders were changed when he was about 6. It changed from Camp 14 to Camp 18. It's a distinction that means a lot in Korea. The camps were right next to each other on either side of the Taedong River. And he also fabricated some details about his life. But the fundamentals of his birth in the camp, his torture in the camp, and the betrayal of his family have not changed. So it's hard to know what truth is in his case. Most people who study trauma, and I have since Shin changed his story, talked to a lot of them and explored that in much more depth than I did before. They say that a coherent, linear story from someone who has suffered torture particularly, but also severe trauma, is very, very unusual. In fact, it's so unusual that if they hear someone telling a consistent, coherent, chronological story with all the details in line over a period of years, they're very skeptical. They think that it may be partially fabricated as a shield to hide behind. And Shin acknowledges that that's exactly what his story is in some respects.